The rattling of a train departing echoed through the small wooden station at Willow Creek, carrying with it the last remnants of Mabel Larson's former life. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks, dampening the black crepe of her morning dress as she sat motionless on a weather-beaten bench. The October wind of 1878 whipped mercilessly around her slender frame, but she barely noticed the chill. Her entire world had collapsed 3 weeks ago when influenza had claimed her husband of just 7 months. The station platform gradually emptied as the few other passengers dispersed, leaving Mabel utterly alone with her trunk and 2 modest valises. Night was approaching, and she had nowhere to go. The letter from her cousin promising accommodation had arrived just yesterday after Mabel had already sold the tiny homestead she'd briefly shared with her late husband. Now she learned her cousin's family had suddenly relocated to California, leaving no forwarding address. Mabel pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her body quaking with sobs she could no longer contain. 22 years old and completely alone in an unfamiliar town hundreds of miles from her childhood home in Ohio. The station master had locked the building an hour earlier, eyeing her with a mixture of pity and impatience before suggesting the town's only hotel and establishment she couldn't possibly afford. As darkness fell, she barely registered the approach of heavy footsteps on the wooden platform. A tall figure stopped before her, casting a long shadow in the fading light. Mabel looked up, hastily wiping her tears with a handkerchief already damp from use. A man stood there, his face partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat. He surveyed her silently, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. His clothes were trail-worn but clean denim pants, a faded blue shirt with a leather vest, and dust-covered boots. A gun belt hung low on his hip. "Madam," he said simply, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle for such an imposing figure. Mabel tried to compose herself, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance and red-rimmed eyes. "Good evening, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man studied her for a long moment, then glanced at her luggage. "You've been sitting here since the noon train," she nodded, embarrassment heating her cheeks despite the evening chill. Without another word, he picked up her trunk with remarkable ease, tucking it under one arm. Then he gathered her 2 valises in his other hand. "Sir, what are you?" Mabel began, alarmed. "Name's Zachariah Zimmerman. Got a place about 2 miles outside of town. Spare room. You can stay till you sort things out." His words were few, but his tone left no room for argument. Mabel stood, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. "I couldn't possibly impose, not an imposition." He nodded toward the darkening sky. "Storm's coming, can't leave you here." As if to emphasize his point, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. Mabel looked around desperately, but the station was deserted, the town largely shut down for the night. She had no money for a hotel and nowhere else to turn. "My name is Mabel Larson," she offered tentatively. "I'm a widow. My husband passed 3 weeks ago." Zachariah nodded once, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Larson, my wagon's this way." Without waiting for further discussion, he started walking, her belongings in his grasp. Mabel hesitated only a moment before following, her heart pounding with equal measures of fear and desperate gratitude. She had no choice but to trust this silent, stern-faced stranger. His wagon stood at the edge of the station yard, a sturdy, well-maintained vehicle with 2 patient horses in the traces. Zachariah loaded her trunk and bags into the back, then offered his hand to help her onto the seat. His palm was calloused but warm against her cold fingers. Once settled beside him, Mabel clutched her shawl tightly as he clicked to the horses. The wagon lurched forward onto the rutted road leading out of town. "Mr. Zimmerman," she ventured after several minutes of silence, "I'm truly grateful for your kindness, but I wouldn't want to be a burden." "Perhaps there's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Weatherby's place is full up with railroad men," he interrupted. "Hotels too expensive for most. Got plenty of space at my ranch. My sister used to stay in the room. It's proper." Mabel swallowed hard. "Your sister," she married last spring. "Moved to Denver." A brief pause. "Rooms just sitting empty." They rode in silence as the first raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a steady downpour. Zachariah wordlessly removed his oilskin coat and draped it around her shoulders, ignoring her protests. The rain was falling in sheets by the time they turned onto a narrow dirt path. Through the curtain of water, Mabel could make out the shadowy outline of a modest but well-built ranch house, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. A dog began barking as they approached, racing toward the wagon. "That's Duke," Zachariah said, the most conversational he'd been. "Good dog, won't bother you none." He brought the wagon to a halt beneath a small covered area adjacent to the house. Before Mabel could move, he jumped down and come around to her side, offering his hand again. The rain pounded around them as he helped her to the ground, then quickly retrieved her luggage. "This way," he said, leading her to the porch and opening the door. Mabel stepped into warmth and light that nearly overwhelmed her after hours in the cold. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting a golden glow throughout a simply furnished but clean living area. A wooden table with 4 chairs stood near a modest kitchen setup. 2 doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms. "Your room's there," Zachariah said, nodding toward the door on the right as he set her trunk down. "Bathroom's out back, got a pump inside for washing up, stove's still warm if you want tea." Mabel stood dripping on the plank floor, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. "Mr. Zimmerman, I don't know how to thank you." He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair with touches of silver at the temples. His face, now fully visible in the firelight, was weathered but handsome, with striking blue eyes that held a depth of experience. Mabel guessed him to be in his early 30s. "No need for thanks," he said simply. "Get yourself settled, I'll see to the horses." With that, he placed his hat back on his head and disappeared into the rain, leaving Mabel alone in the sudden quiet of the house. She moved tentatively toward the room he'd indicated, opening the door to find a small but comfortable bedroom. A neatly made bed with a colorful quilt, a chest of drawers, a small table with a lamp, and a rocking chair by the window comprised the furnishings. It was simple but immaculately kept. Mabel set her valises down and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. Tears threatened again, but she fought them back. This stranger had shown her more kindness than she'd experienced since her husband's passing. The least she could do was compose herself and show proper gratitude. She changed out of her damp clothes into her only other dress, a simple gray wool garment that was thankfully dry. She pinned up her long brown hair, which had come loose during the journey, and washed her face in the basin of water sitting atop the chest of drawers. When Zachariah returned, she was sitting in one of the kitchen chairs, her hands folded in her lap. "Mr. Zimmerman," she began, "I can't express how grateful I am for your help, but I must insist on compensating you for your trouble. I don't have much money," but he held up a hand, cutting her off. "No payment needed." He removed his dripping coat and hung it by the door. "Made some stew earlier. You hungry?" The mention of food reminded Mabel that she hadn't eaten since breakfast, a stale biscuit at the previous train station. "Yes, thank you, and perhaps I could help with chores while I'm here. I'm quite capable around a house." Zachariah nodded, seeming to approve of this suggestion. "Could use the help." He moved to the stove and stirred the contents of a large pot. "How'd you end up stranded at the station?" Mabel explained her circumstances as he ladled stew into 2 bowls and cut thick slices of bread. By the time they sat down to eat, he knew the outline of her situation: her brief marriage, her husband's sudden illness and death, her plan to join her cousin that had fallen through. "I'll need to find work," she concluded. "I was a teacher before I married, but I'm willing to do whatever's available." Zachariah listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply said, "Town's growing. School might need help. Can ask around tomorrow." They ate in companionable silence after that, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. The stew was surprisingly good-hearty and flavorful with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots. "This is delicious," Mabel commented. "You're quite a good cook." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Ma taught all us kids to fend for ourselves, had 5 brothers and sisters. Are they nearby?" He shook his head. "Scattered, parents passed years back, just me here now." After dinner, Mabel insisted on washing the dishes while Zachariah brought in more firewood. By the time she finished, exhaustion was overtaking her. She could barely keep her eyes open. "You should rest," Zachariah said, noticing her stifled yawn. "Been a long day." Mabel nodded gratefully. "Thank you again, Mr. Zimmerman, for everything, Zach," he said. "Most folks call me Zach." "Good night then, Zach," she replied, testing the familiarity of his name. "Good night, Mrs. Larson." "Mabel," she corrected gently. "Please call me Mabel." He nodded once, and she retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Despite her exhaustion and the strange circumstances, Mabel slept more soundly that night than she had in weeks. Morning came with golden light streaming through the small window beside her bed. For a moment, Mabel was disoriented, forgetting where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly. After dressing, she emerged from the bedroom to find the main room empty but the stove lit and a pot of coffee brewing. Through the window, she could see Zachariah in the distance, working with the horses in a corral. Mabel set about making breakfast, finding eggs, bacon, and flour for biscuits in the well-organized pantry. By the time Zachariah returned, she had a hearty meal waiting. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "Didn't expect this." "It's the least I could do," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Please eat while it's hot." They settled into a pattern over the next few days. Mabel kept the house, cooked the meals, and tended a small vegetable garden behind the house that had been somewhat neglected. Zachariah worked from dawn until dusk, managing the modest herd of cattle and the day-to-day operations of the ranch. He wasn't a man of many words, but Mabel quickly learned that when he did speak, his words had purpose and meaning. He was unfailingly polite, always careful to maintain a respectful distance, yet there was a gentle consideration in his actions that touched her deeply. On the 4th day, he drove her into town to inquire about teaching positions. The small schoolhouse was indeed in need of assistance, as the current teacher was overwhelmed with nearly 40 students of varying ages. "Mrs. Larson," the town's school board chairman said after a brief interview, "we'd be pleased to have you assist Miss Peterson 3 days a week. The pay isn't much, I'm afraid." "That's quite all right," Mabel replied, relief flooding through her. "When may I start?" "Monday next, if that suits." As they rode back to the ranch, Mabel could hardly contain her excitement. "It's not much money, but it's a start. I should be able to afford a room in town within a month or so." Zachariah kept his eyes on the road. "No rush. Room's yours as long as you need it." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Mabel found herself studying her taciturn host. In just a few days, she'd come to appreciate his quiet strength and unwavering reliability. There was something comforting about his presence. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked. 12 years, he replied. "Bought it when I was 24, wasn't much then, built most of it myself." "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "You've created something wonderful here." He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Never thought of it that way." "Well, you should. It's a true achievement." The next day brought unexpected visitors, Zachariah's nearest neighbors, the Daltons, an older couple who lived 3 miles down the road. They arrived unannounced, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but Mabel suspected they were curious about her presence. Martha Dalton, a plump, friendly woman with silver-streaked hair, made no attempt to hide her interest. "Well now, Zach Zimmerman, you've been keeping secrets." "Who is this lovely young lady?" Zachariah introduced Mabel briefly, explaining her circumstances without unnecessary detail. The Daltons exchanged knowing glances that made Mabel blush. "You must join us for Sunday dinner after church," Martha insisted before they left. "Both of you." After they departed, an awkward silence fell between Mabel and Zachariah. "People will talk," she said finally. "About me staying here. I wouldn't want to damage your reputation." "Don't much care what people say," he replied, but a frown creased his brow. Sunday brought not only dinner with the Daltons, but also Mabel's first appearance in Willow Creek's small church. She felt the curious stares of the townspeople, heard the whispers behind hands as she sat beside Zachariah in a pew near the back. The Reverend's sermon was on charity and kindness to strangers, which seemed oddly pointed. Afterward, several women approached to introduce themselves, their expressions ranging from friendly curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. "Don't mind them," Martha Dalton whispered as they walked to the Dalton home afterward. "They're just jealous that Zach finally has a woman in his life after turning down every eligible girl in the county for years." "Oh, but we're not," Mabel began, flustered. Martha patted her hand. "Of course, dear, just neighbors helping neighbors." The dinner was pleasant despite the undercurrent of speculation. Henry Dalton, Martha's husband, engaged Zachariah in discussion about cattle prices and railroad expansion, while Martha extracted Mabel's life story with gentle but persistent questions. On the ride home, Mabel broached the subject weighing on her mind. "Perhaps I should look for accommodation in town sooner rather than later. I wouldn't want to cause any gossip." Zachariah's hands tightened on the reins. "That what you want?" "No," she admitted honestly. "I've come to feel safe at your ranch." "But propriety could use a housekeeper," he interrupted. "Permanent position, room and board plus wages, proper arrangement. No one could object to that." Mabel considered his offer. It would certainly solve her immediate problems and allow her to save money from her teaching position. And despite her initial fears, she'd never felt anything but completely safe with Zachariah. "That's very generous," she said. "If you're certain I wouldn't be in the way." "Place runs better with you there," he said simply. As autumn deepened toward winter, Mabel fell into a comfortable routine. 3 days a week, Zachariah would drive her to the schoolhouse, where she assisted Miss Peterson with the younger children. The other days, she managed Zachariah's household, gradually adding her own touches: curtains she sewed from fabric purchased with her first wages, wildflowers arranged in mason jars, a braided rug for the living room floor. She found herself watching for Zachariah's return each evening, enjoying their quiet dinners and the companionable silences as they sat by the fire afterward. Sometimes he would read from one of the few books he owned, his deep voice bringing the words to life. Other times, she would share stories from her day with the children. Slowly, Zachariah began to open up about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, losing both parents to a fever when he was 18, working cattle drives and saving every penny until he could buy his own land. He spoke of his dreams for the ranch, plans to expand when the railroad brought better access to markets. Mabel, in turn, shared more of herself: her happy childhood as the daughter of a doctor, her love of teaching, her brief courtship with Thomas Larson, a traveling salesman who had swept her off her feet with promises of adventure and prosperity that never materialized. "He wasn't a bad man," she explained one evening. "Just full of dreams that were bigger than his abilities. He tried his best." Zachariah nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Some men are like that, promise the moon but can't deliver a rock." As November arrived with bitter winds and the first dustings of snow, Mabel realized with some surprise that she no longer thought of herself primarily as a widow. The sharp pain of loss had gradually softened to a gentle sadness. Increasingly, her thoughts were occupied by the quiet, steadfast man whose home she shared. The first significant snowfall came overnight in mid-November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Mabel woke to find Zachariah already gone from the house, tracks in the snow leading toward the barn. Worried about the animals in the sudden cold, he'd risen before dawn to ensure their comfort. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots and rubbing his reddened hands together, Mabel had hot coffee and breakfast waiting. She handed him a scarf she'd knitted secretly in the evenings, a simple gift, but his expression of surprise and gratitude warmed her more than the roaring fire. "Never had anyone make something just for me before," he said, running his fingers over the dark blue wool. "Well, you deserve it," she replied, "after all you've done for me." That afternoon, with school canceled due to the weather, they worked together to secure the ranch for winter. Zachariah showed Mabel how to wrap the pipes to prevent freezing, while she helped him organize supplies in the root cellar. Their hands brushed occasionally, sending unexpected shivers through Mabel that had nothing to do with the cold. As daylight faded, Zachariah suggested something unexpected. "Got some runners for the wagon, could rig up a sleigh, take a ride before dark if you'd like." Mabel's face lit up. "I'd love that." 20 minutes later, they were gliding across the snow-covered pasture, a heavy blanket across their laps and Duke running alongside, barking joyfully. Mabel's laughter rang out as Zachariah urged the horses to a faster pace, the sleigh bells jingling merrily. "It's magical," she exclaimed, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement. Zachariah glanced at her, a rare full smile transforming his features. "Haven't heard you laugh like that before." "I haven't had reason to in a long time," she admitted. He slowed the horses as they reached the crest of a small hill, allowing them to take in the breathtaking view of the ranch and the distant mountains, all blanketed in glittering white. "Beautiful," Mabel breathed. "Yes," Zachariah agreed, but when she turned, he was looking at her, not the landscape. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. The moment was interrupted by Duke barking furiously at her rabbit trail, breaking the spell. Zachariah cleared his throat and turned the sleigh toward home, the earlier lightheartedness replaced by a charged silence. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Mabel found herself hyper-aware of Zachariah's presence across from her. The months of comfortable companionship had gradually transformed into something deeper, at least for her. But was it the same for him? Or was she simply a convenient housekeeper, a responsibility he'd taken on out of kindness? "Penny for your thoughts," Zachariah said, interrupting her reverie. Mabel smiled faintly. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since that day at the train station, how different my life might have been if you hadn't come along." He studied her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Do you regret it, coming here?" "Not for a single moment," she replied honestly. Zachariah nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Good, place wouldn't be the same without you now." The following week brought a new development. The town council, impressed with Mabel's teaching abilities, offered her a permanent position starting in January when Miss Peterson would be leaving to care for her ailing mother. "It's a full salary," Mabel told Zachariah excitedly when he collected her from the schoolhouse. "I could afford a proper place in town." Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment, fear. It was gone before she could be certain. "That's good news," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You deserve it." That evening, dinner was unusually quiet. Zachariah excused himself immediately afterward, saying he needed to check on a pregnant heifer in the barn. Mabel watched him go, a heaviness settling in her chest. She hadn't mentioned that she had no intention of moving to town. The very thought of leaving the ranch, leaving him, made her heart ache. But perhaps he wanted his space back, his life returned to normal. After washing the dishes, she made a decision. Wrapping herself in her shawl, she ventured out to the barn, needing to clear the air between them. The large structure was warm and dimly lit by a lantern hanging from a beam. Zachariah was in a stall at the far end, gently examining a brown and white heifer. He looked up as Mabel approached, surprise evident on his face. "Everything all right?" he asked, straightening. "I wanted to talk to you," Mabel said, gathering her courage, "about the teaching position. Congratulations again, it's a good opportunity." His tone was carefully even. Yes, it is. But I want you to know I have no intention of leaving the ranch. She took a step closer. Unless you'd prefer I did. Zachariah stared at her, his expression unreadable. Why would you stay? You don't need the housekeeper position anymore. Mabel's heart pounded so hard she was certain he must hear it. I would stay because this has become my home, because I care for this place. She took a deep breath. Because I care for you. The silence that followed seemed endless. Zachariah's face remained impassive, but his eyes, those expressive blue eyes, revealed a tumult of emotions. Mabel, he finally said, his voice rough. I'm not good with words, never have been. You don't need to be, she replied softly. You speak through your actions every day. He took a step toward her, then stopped. When I saw you at that station, I just knew I couldn't leave you there. Wasn't thinking beyond that moment. Then you came here and everything changed. The house felt like a home again, but I never expected. He trailed off, struggling. Never expected what? She prompted gently. Never expected to feel this way again. After Catherine died, I thought that part of me was gone for good. Mabel's heart skipped a beat. Catherine, my wife, lost her in childbirth 6 years ago, lost the baby too. His voice was tight with old pain. Didn't think I'd ever want to risk that again, understanding dawned. That's why you live so alone, why you never courted any of the local girls, he nodded, meeting her eyes directly. Until you brought something back to life in me, Mabel, something I thought was dead and buried. Mabel moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. I understand loss, Zach. I understand fear. But I also understand that life is too precious, too uncertain to waste a moment of potential happiness. His hand reached up hesitantly to touch her cheek. I'm not an educated man, not wealthy or sophisticated, just a rancher with some land and a lot of hard work ahead of him. That's all I could ever want, she whispered. Someone real, someone true. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Zachariah leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Mabel responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zachariah rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said simply. Not as my housekeeper, as my wife, if you'll have me. Mabel's heart soared. Is that a proposal, Zachariah Zimmerman? A rare smile spread across his face. Reckon it is. Not very romantic, standing here in a barn with a pregnant heifer as witness. Mabel laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. It's perfect, absolutely perfect. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Willow Creek, with the Daltons as witnesses and the entire town in attendance. Martha Dalton wept openly, while her husband clapped Zachariah on the back with enough force to stagger a lesser man. Knew you'd find the right one eventually, he boomed. Just took a divine intervention to get her to your doorstep. The school board graciously accommodated Mabel's new status, arranging for a small house to be built adjacent to the schoolhouse for the next teacher and allowing Mabel to commute from the ranch. It was a compromise that suited everyone, especially as the winter weather made travel difficult. Christmas came with a heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for several days. Neither Mabel nor Zachariah minded the enforced seclusion. They decorated a small pine tree with paper ornaments and strings of dried berries, exchanged modest gifts, and reveled in their newly acknowledged love. On New Year's Eve, as they sat before the fire in what was now truly their home, Zachariah took Mabel's hand in his. Never thought I'd have this again, he said quietly. A family, a future to look forward to. Nor I, Mabel replied, squeezing his hand. That day at the station, I thought my life was over. Now I know it was just beginning. Zachariah pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Don't know what made me go to the station that day. Wasn't planning to. Something just told me to change course. Providence, Mabel suggested. Or perhaps angels watching over a weeping widow. Whatever it was, I'm grateful. His voice was husky with emotion. More grateful than I have words to say. As midnight approached, they stood together at the window, watching the star-filled sky above their snow-covered land. Zachariah's arms encircled Mabel from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "What do you wish for in the new year?" Mabel asked. Zachariah considered for a moment. "Not much. Got everything I need right here." His hand splayed protectively over her stomach. "Maybe someday a little one to share it all with when you're ready." Mabel turned in his arms, a secret smile playing on her lips. "I think that wish might come true sooner than you expect." His eyes widened. "Are you saying?" She nodded, joy illuminating her face. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. By summer's end, this house will have a new occupant." Zachariah lifted her gently, spinning her in a circle as laughter, a sound once rare from him, filled the warm room. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I never thought I could be this happy again." "Nor I," Mabel agreed, rising on tiptoes to kiss him as the new year began. Outside, snow began falling once more, adding a fresh layer of white to the land they now shared. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, casting golden light over the two people who had found each other against all odds, a weeping widow and a solitary cowboy, united by a moment of simple human kindness that had blossomed into love. As midnight struck, Zachariah kissed his wife deeply, a promise for all the years to come. "To new beginnings," he whispered against her lips. "To love found in unexpected places," she answered, her heart full to bursting with gratitude and hope. And as the new year's first hours unfolded, they remained by the fire, planning their future and marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them together, from tears at a lonely station platform to joy beside their own hearth. A journey neither could have imagined, but both would forever cherish.